Good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and start on time because it's streaming and people can pick it up on the website later, on the district website later. By the way, I know we have at least one person that's joining us that way, so hopefully Sandy's with us again this morning. I don't think there's any announcements other than I'll make sure everybody's CEUs are signed in for. And everybody has the handouts they need. Kathy will be taking a break sometime in the middle, so just know that that's coming. And I'm not going to do any further introduction of Kathy because as soon as she starts talking, you'll know why we invited her here and why we're so pleased to have her. So here you go, Kathy.
Oh, that's right. I'm good. I think all they have to do is hook me up. Well, I hope you all had a good night's rest. I did. And this morning, I thought about calling this off because it's just one of those days where wouldn't you like to just be outside? It's a beautiful morning outside.
I think we need to congratulate Sarah because every other time we've had district conference here, it's been 100 degrees. Look at it now.
Yeah. So. Good work. I'm not sure how you did that, but she's got the connection, obviously, doesn't she? Yeah, so I am pretty jazzed about this morning and excited, and quite frankly, we're doing pretty good if you looked at how many slides we have. We're moving along. Hopefully today we move along a little faster even, just because I do want to give you a chance to ask questions, and also to make comments because, some of us talked after the session last night. Some of us talked this morning. That's all good stuff. So anything that I need to know before we start? Okay, then first I'm going to follow Chris's instructions. Turn this on. And the green light's not coming on, Chris. Did I do something wrong? Well, I'm going to start talking, and then I'll let you figure out why this is not. What? Could be. I don't get anything when I... Yeah, that's fine. I can talk, and if the slides aren't right, I don't care. I take great pride in being low maintenance. Low maintenance is a good thing. Okay, yeah. Okay, so we're gonna start off by talking about abusers. This is not rocket science. This is why we can move through things pretty quickly. But as you can imagine, I think there have been times historically where we thought we could pick out people who were perpetrators because of their lifestyle or their physical appearance or something that clued us into it. I see us doing it these days with mass shooting perpetrators, where we look at their picture and if they have tattoos and whatnot, we go, oh, somebody should have known, and quite frankly, some of our mass shooters look that way, but some of them don't, and some of them really look different. So who are abusers? Well, I guess the easy answer is they could be anybody. They could look like anybody. They could, that's nothing, there's no characteristic that you can spot physically. There may be some characteristics that you can spot emotionally or that are personality traits that may or may not. I don't know. Yeah, exactly. So 20% of child abuse is perpetrated by strangers. When Steve and I lived in Berkeley, California, when he was teaching at Pacific School of Religion, we lived on a few houses off of Marin Avenue, which literally went up this way, up the top of the hill. And our kids were in school 2 blocks up, and people were shocked that I did this kind of work and let my children walk to school, the 2 blocks to school. And first of all, anybody who tried to stop on that hill would have wound up running through the fountain at the bottom. And so it wasn't, and once you start doing this work and you start to understand that perpetrators, 20% or less. Now, that does not undermine the destruction that one person can do. The statistic I heard a long time ago, haven't heard verified recently, so I need to kind of put that out there, that it may have changed, but I heard that the average stranger molester molests over 360 times before they're caught. Okay, so that means that 20% that are strangers that we think of, that's the guy on the corner, or last night some of us were talking about sex trafficking, and the person who goes online and lures people into those kinds of things. I mean, they are extremely dangerous and they do incredible destruction. But it's important that we know that 80% of child abuse takes place with people who are known to the child. And even in human trafficking, oftentimes the person who's trafficking, that person knows that child. But it's really important to remember that that happens. 3/4 of the incidents of child abuse, child molestation that are reported are done by somebody that the child directly knows. So, I started this work, and you start to get a little paranoid, and you think, why is it that what is the reason why the high school band director is inviting my son over for private tutoring in his home after school and doesn't want me to come and sit there during the lesson, but rather just drop him off? That's when you start to, wow, gee, things just magically happen around here. Isn't that great? Yeah. Anyway, so the vast majority of the times when a child is put in an abusive situation, it's because of somebody they know. So, right away, I always tell people, and it's true even, I talk about domestic violence a lot when I was doing domestic violence. People say, well, I've never known anybody who experienced domestic violence. Well, it's 1 in 3 women in the United States has been beaten by a significant other person in their life. And so if you sit there and you think, I've never met anybody who's been beaten, it's because you don't know. Because I can guarantee you that your mother, your sister, somebody at church, somebody who sits on the same pew as you, somebody who works in your office, somebody that you encounter on a regular basis, like somebody who helps you at the grocery store, somebody out there is a victim of domestic violence, because you can't be 1 in 3 and they're all clustered in one place. And the same thing is true around child abuse, is that it is people among us who may be. And we talk a lot about perpetrators, and sometimes people, don't like that word, because in clergy misconduct, we talk about what we call wanderers, and those are people who have bad boundaries and get sucked into inappropriate relationships, but their intention is not necessarily to perpetrate something. Does that make sense? And those people always confuse us, because we don't know how to handle that. I mean, it's much easier to think that someone who is in either an inappropriate relationship or someone who perpetrates child abuse is just evil and awful and terrible. I remember when I was doing this work, and I'd have people that would say, Michael Jackson can't possibly be a child abuser. I love his music. His music has nothing to do with what he's doing. I'm not accusing him of anything. Do not want to be sued by the Jackson family for saying something. But, I don't know. But the two things don't relate, and the same thing is true for all of us. It can be an uncle, a brother. It can be a father. It can be someone at church that we basically entrust our children to, because we don't know, and we don't know what's going on. So some of the things that we do know about perpetrators that tell us a little bit about, is that, first of all, a lot of times that power and control stuff. We talked about power and control. Well, people who are drawn to power and control may put themselves in positions where they have a lot of power. And it's quite common that somebody who abuses children is what we would call a charismatic leader. It's somebody you like, somebody who has very good social graces. And when you think about it, if you look, I remember when I was younger, I did terrible things like pick up hitchhikers because I thought they were interesting. But I'd drive past somebody and say, oh my God, they look like Charles Manson. If every perpetrator fit that stereotype, we wouldn't be inviting them into our churches, and we wouldn't be sitting on the pew with them. We'd be worried about them. That they're smart enough to know that they have to be engaging and interesting and whatnot, sociable, sympathetic to troubled children. Maybe I had a troubled childhood, and so I'm concerned about high school kids today, and so I want to really meet one-on-one with them to help them. They are more likely to be heterosexual than homosexual. That's a huge myth we have in our culture, is we think homosexual people are perpetrators. And the statistics, quite frankly, are the same across the board. But they're more likely to be married. And there's kind of an age range in which a lot of activity happens. And that's from 18, sometimes younger, but 18, through 35, 40 are the active ages that usually a perpetrator is doing. This statistic says 25 to 34. But that sort of young adult age is often and they are most often educated. Isn't that interesting? We're not talking about guys on Skid Row. So I want to talk a little bit, particularly if you're interested in the more sort of psychological. I would highly recommend that you look at David Finkhorn's stuff. He has this 4-factor theory. He talks about how there has to be a set of circumstances in place for somebody to be a perpetrator. That all 4 of these things have to take place. And one is that they have to have a motivation to sexually abuse. So that has to be there. But there are people who have maybe a motivation to sexually abuse who do not sexually abuse because some of these other factors aren't in there. They have to have the ability to overcome internal inhibitors. And all of us have known what it's like to, walk past a cookie and know we shouldn't eat it, but our voice inside our head says, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it, while the cookie's yelling, eat me, eat me. And you see that going on. So a person who maybe has the motivation to sexually abuse but has good inhibitors tells them it's the wrong thing to do. It's not the right thing to do. They're not going to do it. What are some things that can push a person to not have inhibitors? The most obvious one is alcohol and drugs, because alcohol and drugs suppress our ability to think with that executive part of our brain and are more likely to let us do things that in normal circumstance we wouldn't. So sometimes the inhibitors are a sense of conscience, the values we were raised with, but sometimes they're external things like drugs and alcohol. They have to have the ability to overcome external inhibitors too. Meaning that, they have to not worry about whether the police are going to come get them or somebody's going to report them or the things in our society that maybe would tell them this is dangerous, risky behavior, don't do that. And of course, last, they have to overcome the resistance of the child or the vulnerable person. So, that's where talking about prevention, being straightforward with our children, talking to them about how people shouldn't inappropriately touch them, how they shouldn't be beaten, that they need to report to you as a trusted friend or you as mom or you as grandma, they need to be able to talk about those things, are really important, because a child who is more isolated and more on their own is more vulnerable and becomes one of those 4 factors. I think that's why generally it's pretty, we're still doing lots of research, but the statistics are going to be worse for COVID during the COVID period than they were before, because, you're at home. Maybe the person who's abusing you lives in your home. You don't have a favorite teacher that you feel like you can talk to. There's nobody to report. There's nobody to notice that you're black and blue. So many of those factors that we talked about were taken away during COVID, and we're not there to protect children. So, I said a little bit about that one concept of wanderers, people who are not necessarily evil intenders and doers, but people who have poor boundaries and wind up with things that are inappropriate. If you look at that typology of offenders, you'll see that, obviously there's people that are psychotic, severely borderline, people who we would call sociopaths, people who have serious diagnosable sexual impulse control things. I mean, these are people who have deep-seated issues, chronically neurotic, and isolated people, but there can also be situational offenders, and there can be naive offenders, and there is a whole handout by Finkelhorn about that kind of stuff if you're interested in going in more detail. So, I think we're talking about everything from a person who strategically plans how they can sexually molest a child for an extended period of time, repeatedly, or that kind of perpetrator, to someone who I've known, heard of, met before, perpetrators who, for example, say, well, when I was a kid, my dad, my brothers, my uncles, we'd all sit around and watch pornography and masturbate. So I didn't think there was anything wrong with inviting a child to do that with me, and it's legally sexual abuse. You can do jail time for that. It's not appropriate. Do I always buy that excuse for doing it? Not necessarily, but I can see how you can grow up in a family where there's some kind of sexual activity that most of us would think is inappropriate that maybe you were raised to think is more appropriate. And so those people would wind up being down there. Perpetrators, though, really, really are intent on having access to children. And we call it, of course, grooming. And when you talk about human trafficking, so much grooming happens. We just had a situation in Waco where two young girls, I think they were 13 and 14, were on the internet, of course. We hear so much about that, and met some guys on the internet who convinced them to run away from home, kind of thing. And they actually, it's interesting to see, they didn't, the girls, because they were runaways, didn't qualify for an Amber Alert, but their parents just insisted, and they finally did an Amber Alert on them. And they wound up traveling probably 100 miles because they went someplace close by to meet these guys, and then they basically introduced them to another group who introduced them to another group and another group, and then they wound up pretty close to Austin from Waco all the way down there, where they actually, with the Amber Alert, actually located them. And I think there's going to be 8 to 10 men that are probably charged in the end. Our sheriff is nationally known for his human trafficking work. And these girls texted, the thing that tripped it over for law enforcement to doing the Amber Alert is that one of them texted her parents or a friend and said, help. Okay, because they did not know what they were getting into, and then they needed help getting out of it. But in the beginning, they were very willing participants because they were being groomed, told all kinds of things. Giving special gifts, spending extra time with the child, figuring out a way that you can have alone time with your children or with this one particular child. Playful wrestling sometimes is a start of something. That doesn't mean every time you're playfully wrestling that you're ready to perpetrate some kind of thing, but it's kind of a characteristic. Offering drugs and alcohol. When you hear stories of people who give 8-year-olds alcohol, or let's share a beer. Oh, you're a big kid now. We can do that. And wanting overnight visits with the child so that the child comes home with them are kind of grooming activities. And particularly those giving gifts and getting extra things put a child in a really difficult position, because that child probably likes that attention. When I go with Uncle Bob, he takes me out for ice cream, he orders pizza, he gives me a new toy, we get to play video games. So even though I know it's wrong or uncomfortable to participate in some kind of sexual activity, I'm going to keep the secret because I want to go have ice cream and play video games and do all that. Again, you can see how in a child's mind, they're putting the pieces together incorrectly, but it puts them in a dilemma. Perpetrators groom parents, okay? And I think that's the one that we get stuck on. And quite frankly, the statistics have seen are that the largest percentage of family molestations that happen are single moms and their boyfriends or new husbands. And I know, a lot of us here share the same hair color. It's all just dyed because it's so fashionable, right? But, we're concerned when we see somebody move in with a young mother. And grooming them on means, oh, I just love you so much, when they're really interested in the child, And when you look at it from a single mom's perspective, she's worried that she'll never have another partner in life. She doesn't want to be alone. She's carrying usually a huge economic burden, supporting her children. She may or may not be getting child support. So it's like me saying, oh, I want that guy who wants the keys to take the youth kids because I don't have enough Sunday school teachers. Mom may be so thankful to meet an adult person who she believes truly cares about her and her children, when in fact that person really only is trying to get access to her children. And so that's an example of grooming mom. Buying mom stuff, giving her time, giving her money, doing things to her so that she's more likely to say yes when you say, well, can he come over and spend the evening with me? Okay, where she might have not in another thing, in another situation ever done that. Sometimes perpetrators groom the community. Okay, so they may be well known as a wonderful volunteer. They're the person who's maybe making donations in the right places, who has talent, that they're known in the community. All of the activity they're doing by presenting themselves as a kind, charismatic person is to set up an environment in which they make it more possible for them to have access to children. Okay? And that's what sucks us in. I think that's what kind of gets us. So it's impossible to spot abusers. I think that the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, though, when I'm around somebody who is really in love with power. And I think that's one of the places where our Anabaptist pietist heritage kind of is a good thing, because it tells us, aren't we kind of told that power corrupts and, so I think that resonates with us. But when you see somebody who everything has to be his, I'm using his again, but it could be a she, his way or the highway, where everything's controlled, where they believe that as head of household, and they may use the Bible even to support that they have the right to do with other people as they choose. I think right now we're in a difficult time where we're having lots of discussions about what it means to be a woman and what it means to make choices for yourself. But when you look at children and women as property, as opposed to human beings, you're setting the groundwork for abuse. That's just the bottom line. You're just creating a situation where, my husband would tell you, read the Bible all you want, but in the Old Testament, children were property. They're your retirement plan. They're not people. They're just not. It's Jesus that kind of started turning the tables on that and making that different. So I think it's important to understand that you may see some personality traits that make you suspicious, not make you call up the police and say, I think this person is a perpetrator, but make you be more cautious and careful. And that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. I want to talk just a little bit. I've done whole trainings on when you have a perpetrator in your congregation. And let's see. Yeah, I'm off to the next thing. I put in your handouts 2 things. One's called A Delicate Balance, Making Churches safe and welcoming. And I think I mentioned to you before the situation with the Mountain View Church that has this halfway house for sexual predators 2 blocks, 3 blocks away. Their leader is a good Christian person. He's got some men who really want, that tugs at our heartstrings, somebody. But the church had to figure out what they were going to do to make parents and other people feel safe. So how do you keep your children safe, but at the same time you maintain that welcoming? That article is helpful, I think, on that. And then when abusers are among us, one church's response to perpetrators. I've been involved in a lot of situations as a consultant and also just as a friend with churches where there's a situation of child abuse within the congregation. And when you think about what happens when you think about child abuse in the broadest spectrum, the easiest child abuse to deal with is when it's a stranger, when it's a person down the street, when it might even be a coach or someone, because you can cut off ties to that person and you don't have to see them and nobody has to kind of deal with the aftermath. And quite frankly, I am a huge proponent. We're going to talk more about reporting, but I think reporting is really important, not only because it holds the perpetrator accountable, but I think it's also very helpful because it makes it public. I know that your communities are like my community, where people who are arrested are put in the newspaper. And in communities where it's kept a secret, then you wind up in churches where you've got gossip and people know that somebody's been accused, but it's confidential. Maybe the pastor knows, but nobody else knows. And you get tied up and we've had some situations in churches where the pastor can even get sucked in. I know of a situation where a pastor was told by the lawyer of the perpetrator that she would ruin his chances at getting an objective jury if she told the congregation what had happened. And it was a person who actually had a long history of being a perpetrator and had in the past had to resign positions because of it, and didn't have direct, wasn't a Sunday school teacher or anything, but was around children in the church. And so it left the pastor feeling like, is it confidential information? Should I stand up from the pulpit and say we need to pray for him? How do you let people know? If it's in the paper, it's public knowledge, and then you can more easily, I don't think it's ever easy, you can address it better and say, you probably know so-and-so's been arrested, and until we know what happened, we're going to be taking certain precautions, or we're going to be setting up certain things, or you can start to have a committee that's going to deal with how this works. I want to tell you about a situation that I have permission to tell you about. One of my best friends, and they were my colleagues, they were pastors of another Mennonite church in Texas, found themselves in a situation where they had some friends who actually were their friends before, but moved to the same town they were in Texas. And they thought that was great because here's this other couple. And they had so many things in common with this other couple. Their children were good friends. Their children were the same ages, Their daughter and the other family's daughter went to camp together. And back in those days, this is a long time ago, we didn't have a camp for Mennonite kids in Texas, and so we had to rent a camp, and that meant kids were in tents, and they were roommates, at camp. And my friend's husband called me, and she said, Kathy, I don't know how to deal with this. My daughter came in, he was the pastor. My daughter came in to study and told me that she had a friend who was being sexually molested when she went to stay overnight with her friend's family, So these girls would have been 10, 12 kind of age. When the one child goes over, when her friend goes over to that house, dad molests her. So he didn't quite know what to say because he was smart enough to see through the friend thing right away, and said to her, you can tell me if something's going on. Mom came in and talked to her and whatnot. And of course, what they discovered is that their daughter had been repeatedly sexually molested by the man of this other couple, basically their best friend. And they were the youth leaders in the church, and they taught the Sunday school for that age group. And they had 2 adopted daughters in that age range and everything. And so this all happened on a weekend, and so, deacons and other people were called and not told any specifics because pastor didn't feel like he could go to church and preach a sermon. And they called the police right away. We're going to talk about reporting, but they called the police, and the police said, don't do anything till we interview the child and CPS gets involved and we do some investigation here. So you can't call the moderator of the church and say, I'm not going to be there on Sunday because my child was molested. You have to just say, well, I'm not feeling well and can't come. And the congregation's going like, what the heck is going on? And the thing that I find interesting in this scenario is that the perpetrator was uncomfortable that Sunday morning when he didn't show up to preach. It's like his antennas were out and that he knew he could get caught any time because he was already saying, calling them repeatedly going, is something wrong? Is something wrong? You didn't come to church this morning. They didn't give me an explanation for why you weren't preaching. What's wrong? What's wrong? They were just getting a barrage of phone calls. They got phone calls like that from other people who were concerned. But he was just persistent, which put them in this very awkward spot. So to make a very long story short, they did the investigation. They believed the girl and whatnot. The church's response was first and foremost, I thought, brilliant. And that was they set up care teams around every individual in the story. So the pastor and his wife each had a care team. His wife had a group of 4 women who promised to be there. They had breakfast once a week with her, were there, probably called her almost every day. Not overly intrusive, but giving her a real support system who kept things confidential and she felt like she could really talk to. They did the same thing for the pastor. So it was 4 lay people from the congregation, 4 men who became his support team. They did the same thing for the perpetrator. They did the same thing for the perpetrator's wife. Okay? They did the same thing for the 2 girls because pastor had a daughter. She was going over to her friend's house, and that's when she was being molested. Not only did they give them a lot of care, but they are really the key to the positive outcome of the story. Because the wife of the perpetrator was convinced her husband was innocent because he said he was, and it had never happened, and this was lying, and that little girl was just sexually abused when she was a child, so she's making this up, and it's all fantasies, and he had this whole malarkey stuff that he was telling. And from what I understand, they sat down with her. She was divesting herself of her retirement funds to pay for his attorney. They were getting a second mortgage on their house to pay for his attorney. And so they were financially devastating this family, taking away all their security. And her 4 members, the women on her care team, at breakfast that week, said to her, we know you believe that he's totally innocent, and we will stand by you no matter what. We're here to support you. This is our Christian duty, our obligation, our showing the love of Christ. This is part of what we do as part of the church. But wouldn't you like to know before you lose your home and your retirement and everything else, whether he's really innocent or not? And there must have been something in that conversation that really prompted her, because she turned around and went home that morning, and she called him at work and said, look, I will stand by you and I will love you forever, but I have to know whether you actually did what you're being accused of. And he perpetuated the no, whatever kind of stuff. But at some point that morning turned around and called her back and said, I have to be honest, and yes, I did. I will tell you that the story gets worse, because what they discovered is that he had been sexually abusing both of his daughters, or at least one of them, the entire time, long before he started on other little girls. And the poor child who's in that home is actually bringing her friends over, because when she brought a friend over, she didn't get molested. He molested the friend. So can you imagine the kind of guilt she has as she's growing up about how she tried to protect herself, in a sense, by involving other people? I genuinely thought that this congregation did one of the best jobs I've ever seen. I mean, they set up boundaries for what he could and couldn't do. I mean, in his case, it was a lot easier than some churches because he was arrested. He pled guilty, which was good. I mean, out of that conversation with the care group, it involved a guilty plea, which meant the girls didn't have to testify in court, which is really awesome because that's re-traumatizing in and of itself, going to court and having to tell that story over and over and over again. So that was really positive. I mean, the sad thing is that he spent a couple of years in jail. When he finally got out, he wasn't allowed to live at home, but then he was allowed to start living at home, and they started, and the little girl who was then 14, 15 got pressured by family. She had to tell the court system, CPS, those places, that she was comfortable with him living at home, that things had been taken care of because he had been in therapy and all that. And she got a lot of pressure to do that, which she eventually did. I think there's a lot of people that feel like she didn't really feel comfortable, but that was the only choice she had. And so the family sort of got back together, and of course, wouldn't you know it, they left the church because he was uncomfortable with the restrictions and the contract and the rules that the church had set up with how he could participate in church. You know, he was not allowed to go to the restroom with boys unsupervised. He was not allowed to be the youth leader anymore. He was not, he can't be the camp counselor. He can't be they set up rules so that the parents of other children felt safe, so that the parent of the child that was molested. It is very common for people to leave the church when the secret comes out because you're uncomfortable and they don't know what to do. And one of the biggest things, and I'm sort of gearing off my presentation, so maybe I won't make it to slide 65 here, but I think one of the big things I want to tell churches is I have never seen a situation where a child that's abused and their family can long-term stay in the same church as a perpetrator stays in that church. And let me tell you, it's around domestic violence too. And we do it all the time. We tell women that they need to forgive the perpetrator. And often in domestic violence, there's no legal outcome. You know, there's no definitive, he's guilty. He's still saying, I never did it. I don't believe it. It's just fine. But he's the usher. So when she comes into church, she has to get the plate, pass it down the pew from him. Do you think she's going to stay in that church? She's not. So when we're naive about perpetrators and victims of all kinds of abuse staying in the congregation, I think we need to get smart and realize it's not going to happen. And the sooner we facilitate that exit, we are actually doing the victim a huge, it's a great gift to them. It takes it out of their hands, and it helps us facilitate it. So it means sometimes that we have hard conversations, that we have to go to somebody and say, this person has told us what you've done. You may or may not be guilty, but for the time being, we are a congregation that supports victims, survivors. And therefore, we want the victim, survivor, to feel comfortable in church, and we would be glad to assist you in finding another church home. And that does not mean that you just take them down to the local United Methodist Church and don't tell them what happened. That means you have to tell the pastor, this person needs a new church home because we have a situation of child abuse or we have a situation of domestic violence. I think, we have gotten pretty good at understanding that when people divorce, you almost never keep both people, right? One of them's going to go find another congregation. But in the case of abuse, it's even more important that we are proactive, because if you don't choose who's going to stay in your church, you are by default choosing it's going to be the perpetrator, because that perpetrator is going to make the victim feel uncomfortable, and the victim and his or her family are going to go someplace else. And they're going to walk away feeling betrayed. They're going to feel like you didn't support them, you didn't believe them, you weren't on their side. And it's very hard for us to do that. You know, we are grabbing people off the street and inviting them to church because we want to grow so bad and we want to share the good news and we want more people in the pew. So to actively help someone find another church is really kind of counterintuitive for the way we operate, but it's really critical. Does that make sense? It's hard work, but it's something that needs to be done. So some of this that we're going to run through pretty quickly now is going to kind of correspond with what I said. How do we as a community or church respond? How does religion help or hinder? You know, I can't tell you how many women at my shelter said they would have left sooner, except their pastor prayed with them and told them to read Proverbs about the good wife and go back, and if they were just a better wife, they wouldn't get beaten. You know, how many times is religion used against the victim rather than to help support the victim? And, you know, it's just been something we've done for generations, and so we have to look pretty carefully at that. I think one of the outcomes of the education I did on these issues early on made me look at the way I preached a little differently, because sometimes the way we do the sermon sends the wrong message, quite frankly. Naively, we say the wrong thing that to a victim says, just go home and take it some more. Okay? I don't think we necessarily are trying to send people into abusive things, but I think with my education, and I'm hoping you going forward, you know, right before you get up in the pulpit, if you're preaching, you think, what message am I sending? I'll tell you one good one is suffering. My good Mennonite family, the more suffering you had historically, the more a saint you are. You know, I have a great-grandmother testimony that is chilling, you know, 9 miscarriages, only 3 children that lived, you know, death of 1 or 2 husbands, I mean, storms and blizzards and, you know, you name it, everything horrible and bad, but she was joyful to the end, and wasn't she a saint of the church? And, you know, in her case, it wasn't abuse and whatnot, but in my Mennonite world, we just think suffering is, you know, makes you more saintly. So if you come to the pastor and you say, you know, my marriage is, you know, sometimes women will come to their pastor and say something like, you know, I'm having a hard time in my marriage. They don't start out and say, my husband's beating me. They start out saying, I'm having a difficult time. And if you say, well, just pray more and go right back in there and handle it, and, you know, no marriage is easy, you're just sending them back into it, and you're taking away their confidence in their ability to think about how they could either make a healthy relationship or move on to a healthy relationship. And so I think our crisis, our spiritual crisis in our religion, we need to think very carefully. Like I said yesterday, I believe that there are more child abuse survivors in church than any other place because they have religious and spiritual questions. And as a pastor or a lay leader or a Sunday school teacher, you may never hear their story. They may not share it with you. It may be something that for them is buried deep and they don't want to. And I am constantly surprised by people that I've known my whole life who tell me stories about abuse that I could never imagine had experienced that. So, you know, I have to think when I'm preaching from the pulpit, what does the message I'm saying result in? When I was doing, back when we had Jubilee curriculum, remember that? That's like eons ago. You know, I wrote a lesson and I wanted the theme to be, Jesus loves you just the way you are. Oh, it sounded so good. And then I started to think about how many little boys there are that are already perpetrators, sadly. You know, do I want to tell them Jesus loves you just the way you are? I mean, I got to reframe that a little bit. You know, Jesus loves you and he expects improvement on all of us. You know, it's got to be a little different when you think of it from the perspective of a victim or survivor, right? So in church, what do we do most commonly? Minimize, deny, blame. It's not their fault. They had a rough childhood. I don't believe it really happened. I've known him all my life. He's wonderful. We always pressure the victim to stay, to try harder. What did you do? And we say that sometimes to child victims, which just, makes your blood boil. But we'll say to a child, what did you do to encourage him to molest you at age 12? Like it's her fault, it's not her fault. Rather than saying to her, I know you couldn't do anything about it, and I believe you, and this should not have happened to you. We collude sometimes with the abusers. Abusers, like I think my example was a good one of the perpetrator's lawyer who pressured the pastor into not saying anything, so that there were a significant number of people who were child abuse survivors in that congregation, who really felt betrayed by the pastor because the pastor was keeping this secret. And here's this guy on the pew with them that's had these, and he went to prison eventually. So it wasn't like it was made up. We need to be careful about how we use religion to justify abuse. And even in this day and age where money and resources are tight, we need to think about how we can, not just emotionally, but also physically support families that have abuse going on in their, because things like counseling, if you don't have, even if you have good insurance, what does your insurance do? Pay for 8 sessions or something? Well, let me tell you, 8 sessions drop in the bucket if you have somebody who's suffered serious abuse. So who's going to step up and help that family? And there are multiple ways to step up. Maybe you can find a therapist who's willing to reduce their charges. Maybe you do have a benevolent fund and you can provide some support, but you have to think about how you can provide support to the victim. So I think religion can be a huge roadblock for victims. It can also be a saving grace in the way they find healing. And that's our job in the church, is to put ourselves in positions where we overcome those roadblocks and we provide resources, emotional and financial, and in all different ways that help the person move on. And I think, that's why they come to church, is they come for answers, they come for love, they come for support. Sometimes family and our church family and our community are the things that help us survive horrible things and help us become people who maybe can never forget what happened to us, but we can move on and it doesn't have to be the center of everything for us. I have a friend who said she describes healing after abuse as, it's like remember in the old days, you all are old enough to remember when you used to turn on the screen and it was just gibberish. It looked like the TV after 2 a.m, just stuff all over. She said, counseling helps you put all those issues into file folders where you save it on your hard drive. And sometimes it's going to pop up and hit you in the nose and you're going to have to, that's PTSD. The issue comes back up, it's triggered. And sometimes you intentionally look in the folder because you want to work on something. But every morning you wake up, it's not just staring you in the face. That's what healing is, because you don't really ever overcome it. So, I think that's our job in the church, is to create those situations and places where people can feel comfortable and can heal. So roadblocks, I think, are misuse of the text. I told you about the guy who said it was honor your father and mother, using Proverbs, the good wife, submission. And there are some really good books. I probably should have started out the presentation yesterday and today to just tell you that Faith Trust Institute is just an awesome resource. And, I do child abuse training and consulting for them. Sometimes they send me to individual congregations, and sometimes we do big trainings. But their resources are incredible, and they're free online. And there's a lot of your handouts are there that I pulled down for you. But there's a lot of good stuff in there. There are sample sermons to talk about child abuse, because I think pastors should talk about that kind of thing. I don't think there's anything wrong with doing a sermon about how you shouldn't abuse children. Or I think it'd be ideal if every pastor would talk about human trafficking, because it's so pervasive in our communities. These aren't topics that just need to be left to Sunday school and down in the basement. These are topics we need to talk about in church. But to create environments where we find scriptures that support victims, that help victims, rather than always using, and correcting the misuses of Scripture when we hear it happen. You had a question. Faith Trust Institute. Okay, and it's in the presentation at the end, so you've got the website for them. And quite frankly, they have given me permission to use their handouts without paying them, so it's a good thing, right? Often in churches, we don't understand violence, and we don't understand the cycle of it. Just to touch on domestic violence, which is not our topic, and I know you feel like I'm slipping in a lot, but in domestic violence, there's a cycle. And that cycle can happen in child abuse too, where something horrible, awful happens, and then the good, we call it the honeymoon phase, happens. Let me buy you a new purse. Let me take you on vacation. I'm sorry, it'll never happen again. Then you wind up moving into the tension building, and it happens again. That happens a lot. So we have to understand how violence happens and how it can happen in homes. Prioritizing forgiveness and restoration over safety of the victims. All of us, and even more so in our tradition, want to see happy families, and we want to see people reconciled. I have a son who spent 3 years being separated from his wife while they're working things out. The shouts of joy and just without any questions from all of my family when they reconciled was wonderful in this case. But we all too often in the church want to push people back into happy families. I hope that none of you perpetuate that idea that God hates divorce. I mean, who loves divorce? Nobody loves divorce. And nobody I know who's ever been divorced wanted to be divorced or was happy about being divorced. But yet we treat it like it's some sort of thing that people choose happily, I guess. Violence and molestation happens, and when it happens within a family, it may not be possible for that family ever to be restored. There are lots of times where the relationship between the victim and the perpetrator can never be healed. And we have to accept that, and we have to allow that person to take their own time to healing. And when you think about religious issues that get in the way, forgiveness, how we talk about forgiveness is huge. Because there are some who literally find out somebody was abused one day, and the next day are talking to the victim, telling them they need to forgive the perpetrator. Well, they haven't even come to grips with what happened to them. And we have to understand that forgiveness happens because the person who was sinned against takes the time to heal and figure it out, and at their own speed, which may be never, or maybe 10 years from now, or maybe a year from now, they have to set the pace for forgiveness. Those of us from the outside and in the church can't tell people when they have to move quickly on. And we have a tendency to do that because we want to see the happy family sitting together at the back of the church, at the pew again. And we say, oh, they got together and they overcame all their problems. Not our job. So resources that we can provide. Let's see, what do I have here? What are some of the roadblocks? I did that. What are resources? So obviously support, listening. Abuse is like any situation where somebody's been traumatized. I mean, probably every one of us has had a relative or a family member who is like a broken record, and you've heard the story a million times, and they keep telling it over and over again, and you want to shake them, and you want to say, get over it, move on, I'm tired of hearing about that. And that is not a good Christian response. Because people who are trying to heal are going to tell the story over and over again. It's our natural instinct to do that. If you've been in a severe car accident, if you've had a health crisis, you know that you wind up, I got COVID in Europe and was stuck for a week. Well, I tell everybody about it, and sometimes I tell them twice. And that's a silly example, but when it comes to abuse, we have to be patient and listen to that story again. Because that is part of the person externally processing what their experience was. And they're looking to see whether you're going to be patient and listen and emotionally support them, or whether you're just, okay, let's move on. So it takes some skill from us in terms of active listening. We need to provide safety. Whenever an accusation has been made, the last thing we worry about is hurting somebody's feelings. The first thing we worry about is the child safe? You know, can we make sure that this is not going to happen again? We don't know whether it happened or not sometimes. We just hear the story. Our job is to make sure it does not happen again. And we are not the experts who can decide what happened. The other big thing that we do in the church is we want to do our own investigation because we don't want anybody to be falsely accused. Well, we just know what a child abuse accusation is going to do to their career. They're going to get suspended as a teacher. They're going to lose their credential. They're going to be, something's bad's going to happen if an accusation is made. And so we say, well, we're going to find out before we call authorities. It's not our job. It's not our job. The law is that if you suspect child abuse, then you turn it over to the professionals who we hope can really do an investigation and really tell us what happened. And, you know, I just said with an adult victim, you listen over and over again. With children, you do not, because investigators will tell you they want to hear the story and they want to hear it directly from the child. You know, and it's so funny. Well, so funny, it's not funny. I often hear, well, the child changed their story. Think about it from a kid's perspective. I love this title, Through the Eyes of a Child. Okay? Think of a child, and they tell you a story, and you don't believe it. What do they think? They think they told you the wrong aspects of it. Okay, so if I change up a little bit, this part of it, and tell it again, maybe you'll believe me this time. Well, this time you don't believe him either. So maybe they add something, maybe they take away something. Sometimes they honestly remember something they didn't remember before, but it is very natural for a child to change the details without changing what really happened. You want to say something to that because you're an expert in this.
Yeah, I just wanted to say it's really important what you're talking about. I think it's also important we let people know that a child, if this happens to them, if anything happens to them that's actually a bad occurrence, they will blame themselves first for everything. So it's important to kind of look at that from their lens, as the title says here. So could you speak more to that, how they interpret the?
Well, yeah, I mean, they think it's their fault.
Yeah.
I mean, it's completely their fault. I did something wrong. I let this happen. I encouraged this to happen. I'm a bad person. I've heard about how this is awful, and look at me. Now I'm doomed. You know, if they come from sort of that family or theology that says you're going to hell if anything like this happens. I mean, if you're a young girl and you're told that having premarital sex means that you're tainted forever, you know, you think you're ruined goods before you even got old enough to even think about what it is. But that is their natural instinct, and that's also one of the things you'll hear in their stories is a reluctance to tell it because they think they're confessing when they're actually reporting. Would you say that's fair to say that? Yeah. Spiritual crises. Oh, you've got something to say. I see you like it, and I feel like I'm a moderator. Microphone one.
Thing that happens with them is they are trained that when that person comes to help them, they don't talk about it. Oh, no, that doesn't happen in my house. So you have to be
And
real careful.
oftentimes they've been very threatened.
Oh, yeah.
You know, I mean, the most common is if anybody finds out, they'll put me in jail and take me away, and you will live on the street, or you'll be homeless, or you and your mom, you know, will never see. I mean, but it gets even worse than that. I mean, it can be, I am going to come after you. I will beat you. I will, if you tell anybody, you will not be my child anymore. I mean, the threats, it's not just, it's the seduction and the grooming, but it's also the laying the threats on too. Some of the things I think in church we need to talk a lot about is doubt. Survivors have questions about, why did God let this happen to me? Why didn't God answer my prayers? I've never met a victim that didn't say they prayed that it would end. They prayed that God would protect them. I mean, those are just common things. I mean, these are hard things to preach about from the pulpit, but we need to take them on. Fear and guilt. harmful beliefs. And so by harmful beliefs, one of the things I'm talking about is I must be a bad person. I must have done something wrong to deserve this. You know, I deserved, even adults will think that they deserved what happened to them, you know. So it was things I did in my childhood, or something that I did. I broke my mother's vase, and that's why now I'm being molested. They'll put things together. Passages that, you know, that we have to be careful with sometimes are turn the other cheek. You know, just keep on taking it. Proverbs, obviously, 31 is from verse 10 and on. There's a lot of other texts that when you look at it, think about the Samaritan woman from the perspective of a victim. And it changes the way you look at it. We're going to breeze right through that. But those are all things where you have to look at how is the passage, the scripture you're using, how's it being used? Is it a roadblock that would keep somebody in a victim place and support the abuse? Or is it something that might be a resource that would lead to healing? Okay, so we're going to talk more about reporting and some of this stuff that we've already sort of begun. This is something that I cut from this presentation, and I would highly recommend that you might want to purchase it as a district. And I think they're changing things at Faith Trust where you may be able to download parts of it, which you could use in a presentation. If you were giving a presentation, or if you're working with a Sunday school class or somebody and you're working on abuse, but it is, it's a video. And it's called Hear Their Cries. And it is actor portrayed real stories, and it is powerful. It's, it used to be a VHS tape. And when I show it, and usually when we do 9 hours, I show you part of it. It's extremely moving because you hear 3 different scenarios of people who have been molested as children, and one was physical violence, a young man who was beat by his parents. But, you know, you hear their stories and the impact it has had on their life going forward. When I worked in domestic violence, I didn't use it as much because I had victims who were at the point of healing in their life where they were willing to publicly talk about what happened to them, which is better, you know, because if you were hearing the story from someone who you even knew perhaps, that would be a powerful message to understand what happened to them and what was helpful for them in healing, what was not helpful, and hear more about theirs. But if you don't have that, and you don't always, because it takes a lot to go public and tell everybody about what happened to you, particularly as a child, and you have probably spent a lifetime processing it. But this video is really good. And so for little churches where it's more expensive than you want, and you're only going to use it maybe once in a while, it might be a good district resource, actually. You might look at it. But it specifically has people listen to the stories, and so you can help people understand a little bit more about the actual situations. So, and I think the thing that in these workshops that makes people the most nervous is, what the heck am I going to do if a child comes to me after Sunday school and tells me that something awful happened? A long, long time ago, when there was a thing called the Association of Brethren Caregivers, we used to do a lot of child abuse trainings, and we had a couple of victims who were really willing to talk about their experience. And I think part of what made it so powerful is that they were good Church of the Brethren folks with good Church of the Brethren last names. And one of the things that I still remember from it, it was really interesting, and some of you may even know some of these people because they were pretty willing to write articles for the Messenger and be pretty public about their own stories. But what I loved was we paired up 2 victims who had the same story but opposite reactions. One was a good Brethren girl who lived on a farm in a rural area, going to a rural church, and her father would have sexual intercourse with her, quite frankly, while mom went out. It was a dairy farm. While mom went out to milk the cows every morning, most every morning, came in before light even, and would molest her. And she lived through that for just years and years kind of thing. And finally, of course, you know, it ended. Sometimes that sexual abuse, sometimes people are attracted to children so much that when they get older, they stop. And sometimes they'll stop molesting a child when they worry about the child getting pregnant, too, because that's obviously the secret's going to be out then. So sometimes it happens. Sometimes it happens because dad dies or the uncle goes away or something else happens. But in her case, no accusations were made. It just continued. It was devastating. And in school, she was the perfect student. Perfect student. Because that was her way of coping with all of it, was to excel and be perfect. Everything she did, every time you saw her, she was modestly dressed, but neat as a pin. She married a husband. She had a lot of issues in her marriage, and I think that's where she really started to seek out counseling and start to be able to understand her own story and become part of that. And her situation. Thank you.
You have a choice.
I'll just watch me spill, and I did. Oh, Dave Sollenberger would be proud of me. I'm making a mess, right, in church. That happened to her, and that's the way she coped. And in her adult life, she coped that way. She became the head of the department at Good Brethren College. You know, she excelled in everything she did. The other young lady, oh, you're so good, you're so good. The other, and this is being recorded forever, so you know, you and I will be the somebody probably, and it could be Chris, will take it and put us on YouTube,
And he'll put our names,
we'll
Kathy
name
and Kathy.
Kathy and Kathy doing it, and then we'll have thousands of hits, and
And
maybe we'll
retire.
get, exactly, maybe we'll get rich because somebody's, anyway, okay, getting back to the subject. The other person, almost the same scenario, grew up in a rural area, was molested by her father early in the mornings when her dad did whatever, you know. And her response was the opposite, was because she was that whole thing about I deserved it. She was sexually active. She started being promiscuous with the temporary help at the farm. She ran away. This was before we talked about human trafficking. Now we would understand much more that she was human trafficked. But back then we would have said, oh, she chose this promiscuous lifestyle. But she acted out multiple marriages, lots of affairs, had this reputation in his town as being this loose woman because that's the way she coped with it. And I always found that so fascinating that you have two scenarios that are very different, but they're very common. They're both kind of common stories. So, if you're a teacher, you don't just look for bruises and whatnot. You also look for little girls who want everything to be perfect. Isn't that interesting? Could be a little boy, too. The one who's got to have everything exactly right, that needs to excel, that cries when he misses one on the spelling test. That can be a way that they're doing. So when you suspect child abuse, it is your job to report it. In Texas, every adult person is a mandated reporter. And Texas is not known for good legislation. We're always glad there's Mississippi and Alabama out there who usually do us one better. So we're, on the list of 50 states, we're real happy when we're only 48. But in this case, we actually have some really good laws. And one of them is every person is a mandated reporter. And I looked up Kansas, not so good. Kansas is not so good. Now, your anonymity is protected if you make an accusation unless it can be proven that you're doing it for evil intentions, meaning you want more child support or you want a divorce or you're just plain trying to get back at somebody. But it is important, I think, for us to understand. That's why when we started with what's our Christian obligation, what is our ethical mandate, why is we as Christians, why do we have to do what I'm encouraging you to do? That's why. It's not about the state law. It's not about the government. It is about protecting a child. And far too many churches have thought they could solve this problem on their own. You know, I'm going to talk to him and tell him not to do it again. We're going to have a committee, and we're going to intervene, and we're going to carry out some sessions with the family so that he stops doing what he's doing. In most cases, that desire to molest or abuse a child is so deep that it is something that is very difficult to overcome. And therapists will tell you that some of the most difficult therapy work in the world is working with perpetrators. And that can't even start until they admit that they actually are a perpetrator. And quite frankly, almost none of us can do that. It's out of our hands. And that's why, if safety is the number one concern for that child, then the first thing we have to do is report. And I recommend to churches that what you want to do is you don't want to get caught off guard. You don't want to have a child report something to you and you go, oh, no, I heard Kathy and she said report. Now what the heck do we do? Go back to your church and talk to church leaders and say, what are we going to do if? Remember, I told you I went from not thinking anybody in my church, none of those 7,500 children, and then I got flooded with stories. If you go back and you even start telling people, I went to this child abuse training, you're going to start hearing stories. You may not hear from a child that says this is currently going on. You are more likely to hear from adult survivors. But you may hear from a child, and you need to think ahead of time what you're going to do. Okay? And what you're going to do is, first and foremost, get yourself some help. So don't do it alone. And if you're a pastor, you need to volunteer to be there when those calls are made. You need to say to people, Sunday school teachers, if you get an outcry, come to me and I will sit with you while you call, because it takes support, right? So you need to have people who you feel comfortable with who are going to help you through that process. And when you do a report, they don't ask for a lot. You know, they're going to want to know your name, your address, all that kind of stuff, and be able to contact. They're going to want stuff about the victim, you know, so you need to know who the parents are, where they live, people's names and whatnot. And they're going to want a very brief thing about why you suspect that there's child abuse, okay? And you need that support because this is going to go in multiple directions. Okay? If it has anything to do with the church in particular, particularly if the molestation happened at church in Sunday school or something, you need to call your insurance company. You need to tell them. You need to call the right authorities and report that that abuse is going on. And then you need to step back. And I highly recommend the scenario I told you about, that little church, the Mennonite church, where they had care groups. And then they, you know, it's like then they separated themselves from the legal aspect and became more concerned about the care and support of the people who were involved in the actual stuff that was going on. Does that make sense? So you want to make sure that child's protected. You want to stop the abuse from happening. And then after that's over, you can start trying to heal the victim's brokenness and, if possible, restore the family to a unit or mourn the loss of that relationship. Okay? So, when abuse happens in a family, it is basically the same thing, you know. The child may disclose abuse to someone else, and that person may come to you and say, I don't know what to do. My child just told me they're being molested. You're going to help them report to law enforcement. You never, ever, ever go to the abuser first and tell them that you've heard something, that they're doing something, and you don't give them heads up that you're reporting them. That just gives them more time to come up with a credible story, quite frankly. And so you want to call and report first. And after the investigation and after adjudication, that's when you start thinking about restoring the family if it's possible. Anyone can report child abuse, and you're not held liable as long as it's made in good faith, like I said before. And reporting laws. I printed out the Kansas reporting law. It should be in your packet so that you know. And like I said, with Kansas, clergy are not mandated reporters, but we should consider ourselves mandated reporters. Yes. Yep.
Quick question. Western Plains District is Kansas, Nebraska, and Colorado. So just like where, if you're from Nebraska or Colorado,
Just
or
if you
someone's
go to your
streaming-
state government, it's
State
got
government,
it'll
okay.
have the stuff. And there are actually some websites, I don't know if I put it in here, that do all the states, and you can just click on your state and you can check, because that's where I got the Kansas reporting laws. But I could have gotten Colorado too, and Nebraska and whatnot, because they're all there. And it does vary. It really varies. And it's important you know, because if you're a mandated reporter and you don't report, you've just put yourself in legal jeopardy. And if you're a pastor, you've just put your congregation in legal jeopardy. You know, so you need to know if you're a mandated reporter for sure. But I think it's really important that we as Christians think of ourselves as mandated reporters, because that's the only way to stop the abuse. Just pause everything so an investigation can take place and we can figure out what we are going to do next. So, yeah. So, you know, whether you're required to report or not, we encourage you to do it. Ministers are supposed to do it. They don't like that job, but we have to do it. Remember, it's your job to report, not to investigate. We can't say that enough times, because that's the the weeds we get stuck in, as we think, oh, he's a nice guy. Let me go find out. Let me talk to him and see what he says. I want to tell you a story about reporting. It's in my book. Steve was teaching at Pacific School of Religion. I was associate pastor. I told you about that. I have 4 kids. The 4 kids were going to school. Everything was fine. I think Jesse, my youngest, who's always been an interesting child. I could probably write a book just on stories about Jesse. He's my youngest child. He was in, I want to say, 1st, 2nd grade, probably. And he had a terrible habit. Terrible, terrible habit. He liked to take the bubble gum on the playground from under the slide and the swings and every place that people stuck their used bubble gum. And he must have been in kindergarten, because he took a nap, so he was younger than I thought. And he'd put it in a big wad. He'd come in after recess, after lunch in particular, and he'd have this big old glob of used bubble gum, and he was just chomping away at it. And the teachers had to take it away from him, because that's really not a good habit to have. And tried to explain to him, used bubble gum is not a good thing. I mean, in this day of COVID, we'd all freak out. But back then, you know, we just said, oh, that's dirty, don't do it. And one day he came in. I know he was still in a nap-taking stage, because he laid down for his nap. And he decided that he was going to be like Lone Ranger and have a mask. And he took his bubble gum and he started stretching it from this ear to that ear, back and forth and back and forth. You're going to start to wonder, where were the teachers? But he managed to really just cover his eyes with this bubble gum, this used bubble gum. And so after nap, they discover that here's this kid stumbling and running into things because he's got wads of bubble gum covering his eyes. And they go to take it off, and it doesn't come off. It's really stuck on. And so they're peeling it off, and it's just bad. Well, it's one of those days where this is really not a good Steve Reid story. Where I dropped him off, his dad picked him up, and in a stereotypical male fashion, he picks up a child who has sort of these weird-looking eyes with gum stuck all over, and he doesn't ask any questions. He just brings the child home, So anyway, we're dealing with this that night, and we're trying to get this bubble gum off. And quite frankly, I got, you take ice cubes, and you're supposed to make them cold, and you can't put ice on a child's eyeballs, and I'm trying to not have him still have eyebrows and things, and we're peeling it off and we worked really hard at getting it off. So next day we sent him to school. The other thing that went wrong, there were multiple things that went wrong in this. Apparently the afternoon staff never told the morning staff, didn't leave the note about what had happened to Jesse. So when he showed up at school, the teachers just see a face that's black and blue, because overnight it had just bruised itself horrendously. And the school nurse was doing lice checks that day, and she came through and she sees the bruises, and she says to Jesse, "What happened?" And he said, "My parents did this to me." which was true. I mean, we had picked off the gum, but anyway, he said, my parents did this. They took him to the principal's office. The principal and the counselor came in, and they had a heart-to-heart conversation with him and asked him about ways that he was, how did this happen? And ways that he was disciplined. And he told them 3 things. His parents beat him with a belt. They hang him out the window by his feet. And, I can't remember what the third one was. But there were 3 definitive. Oh, throw him down the stairs. We throw him down the stairs. 3 things we do to discipline him when we're angry at him. And so I have to say by 10:30, I had CPS on my door. Now, I'm an associate pastor taking care of children. Here's CPS telling me that an accusation's been made about child abuse in our family, and they're there to investigate. I had just signed a contract to write a child abuse prevention curriculum. Can you see that headline? Unfortunately, I was working for a United Methodist Church, so it would have said United Methodist Church pastor accused of child. And dealing with it is just one of the most difficult things you can do, because you can't talk to your kids about it because you don't want to be accused of coaching, right? You can't talk to them. And the first thing they told me is that very day, they were sending case managers into my other 3 children's classrooms at school, and they were going to interview them. Now, I'm a fortunate person in the sense that the system really worked for me, because they interviewed the kids, and the kids just said, yeah, that's the story Jesse would tell, but that's the kind of kid he is. He makes things up, and no, that never happens. And I guess they had very believable stories. They were believed. We were checked out. People were contacted. I'm trying to figure out, who do I trust to even tell this story to? I went for years where I never told anybody about what happened to us. I mean, we were so fortunate, because I think within 2 weeks, a month, they came back and said, you're cleared, don't worry about it, everything's fine, the case has been closed, and we lived on pins and needles. Our oldest son, who is 7, 8 years older than Jesse, was furious with Jesse for years, because he was old enough to know that had the accusations been believed, his dad could be in prison, our family could have been ripped apart. There's so many horrible things they could, who would invite a former child molester to do Bible study at annual conference, he was smart enough to see the consequences and was so angry at Jesse for fabricating this story. It took us years to get to a place where we could talk about it, and it took me years to get to the place where I felt like every chance I get in a setting like this, I can tell that story, and I need to tell that story, because you need to know that while sometimes the system does not work, we have a crisis in Texas. Children are dying in foster care, and it is not a good situation, and kids slip through the cracks all the time, unfortunately, regardless of how well-intended and how well our CPS and other people, our child welfare workers are. And many times it has nothing to do with them at all, but it is a system that is overloaded with far too many cases. It's a miracle that they showed up on my door the same day. They said the only reason they let Jesse come home was that he was giggling while he was telling them these stories about the belt. And so they really didn't feel like he was in any imminent, that anything bad was going to happen to him when they sent him home. Otherwise, he would have had to go into some kind of temporary care until they investigated. So here's the end of the story, though. I'd say a good 3-4 years later, he and I are driving in the car. We're taking 2 cars. Steve's got the other bunch. I've got him. He's in the other seat. And I decided, I just felt comfortable. It was time to say something. And I said to him, Jesse, remember when you had the bubble gum on your face and you told people that we were beating you and throwing you down the stairs? Why did you tell that story? And he got real quiet. And he said, because that's what was happening to Mookie, who was his best friend, who slept next to him at nap time on the cot next to him. My child was trying to call for help for somebody he knew was being mistreated, and he was unsuccessful. And today he remembers that. He's 40. He remembers that. So the system worked great for me, right? It wasn't so hot for Mookie. And I never knew what happened, and I never knew whether anybody reported it, or by that time we had lost track of them, they had lost track of us. There wasn't much that could be done. But I always want to tell the story because I think we're sometimes too afraid to report, and we're too afraid to have our suspicions. And there are times when mistakes are made, but we have to trust that system because it is the best system we have. And the alternative is that abuse just keeps happening and that children are not safe and that no one's protected. Does that make sense? And so even though it's some of the hardest thing you can do, and that's why I am a huge proponent of think it through ahead of time. The other thing is I always tell people, and I tell them this about domestic violence, rape crisis, all of that. Make friends with the professional people in your community that are doing this work. If you're not sure whether it's reportable, have a social worker friend that you can call and say, I just heard this, this, and this, and I'm on the fence and I don't know, should I report? Because if you have a professional friend to run it by, you have, well, they're mandated reporters. They're going to have to report it if you don't, but you've got a professional person to back you up and help you. And when I was at domestic violence shelter, the first 6 months, I was so idealistic coming there. I asked somebody, what are the 5 top pastors in this town? And I called them all, and I said to them, they're secretaries, because they're all highfalutin, they have secretaries. I called and I said, I'm the new executive director at Family View Center. I'm new to town. I'm not asking for donors or volunteers. I just want to meet the pastor and get to know them. And do you know that of the 10 top pastors in Waco, there was only one that was willing to see me. One that was willing to see me. I would have in that job loved it if a pastor had called me and said, Kathy, I know you're the executive director of Family View Center. I want to know more about how domestic violence is helped and what resources are here for domestic violence victims in Waco. And I'm new to Waco. Can we go to lunch? I'll pay for lunch even if they'd invite. So, one of my homework to do things is go back to your community and find out who does this stuff. Hooray if you have some social workers in your congregation, if you have professional people already, but find somebody who's a therapist who will let you consult with them. Find out who does domestic violence. Where's the nearest domestic violence shelter? How do you get somebody in? Because believe me, if you need their resources, you're probably going to need it on the weekends at night. And that's not going to be a time when you're going to be able to find people who help you. So find out ahead of time. And the same thing is true with this issue, is find people who can be backup and support for you as you go through it. Find people at another congregation even who are willing to help you, that you can buddy up with, who are willing to listen when you go through it, because it's not easy work and you need support. So find community resources and find resources within your church and think ahead about how you would handle it if a child were to report to you that there was something going on that you need to report. Does that make sense? It is 10 o'clock exactly. Did you raise your hand and I didn't see you? You were getting ready to. Yeah, that's great. So I want to just stop right there for right now, give you guys, we're not going to take a terribly long break because unless you're tired of me, I'd like to really cruise through and cover more before 11:30, but let's take 10 minutes if you need to go to the bathroom or just stretch your legs or yawn or lay down on the pew and take a nap, circle the E's in the handouts or, something, take a few minutes to take care of yourself.
Well, the 10 minutes of our 10-minute break are up, and so we'll get ready to start again. I know folks are coming in from getting their coffee downstairs, and I don't know that Kathy got a break, but you got to sit for a little bit. We have Kim and Christy here from Mutual Aid, and we want to thank them for sponsoring this. It's a new thing had sponsors. I had never even thought about reporting something that would happen to the church.
Do you want, if you have an insurance policy with you, a church insurance policy, you would want to know, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I was talking.
And I work a lot in insurance. Actually, I've done a lot with ABC and some other stuff I did for the church. I've worked in insurance, and I think it's awfully easy to say, well, I can't report anything because my rates are going to go up. But in actuality, if you want to protect your rates from going up, giving them a heads up is better. Working with them rather than trying to hide something that could be mean and ugly. And so it's really important churches know that they are your advocates. And if you go to do background checks on Sunday school teachers or something, and you have Aunt Susie who's been teaching for 30 years, and you try all the nice stuff about saying, you need to we're going to do background checks, we're going to do them on everybody. And she says, how dare you insult my integrity? I've been doing this for 30 years, and now you're making me do a background check. I have two hints with that. One is the pastor and you, if you are the pastor or the lay leaders, the head of Sunday school, you volunteer to be the first ones to do it, so they see that you're doing it first, and that I'm doing it. I could be insulted, but I'm not. I'm doing it. I'm getting a background check done. But the second thing, if they're still just dead in the water, sure that they can't do it, then you blame it on the insurance company. You tell them, well, it's one of those things our insurance company says we have to do.
There you go.
And they're happy to take the blame because they want you to do that, right?
The other thing I'd add that was a really good reminder is, I think you're getting into like how to get policies together or whatever, is that, we've been here and we've done this and we get this all in place. And then when the next person comes, they need to know about that too. So to just make sure everybody in the congregation knows about it, and that as leadership changes, that
That you
gets
keep
passed
that
off.
momentum going.
I think we've got another hook in this district, and that is we have to have them camp.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
we have to have camps have to have the church too.
Yeah, and that's, and I've always found when I'm training churches, is the churches that have daycare centers understand it, because they have to legally do all of this stuff, and that's really good, because you can go get forms and copies of things and say, we're just going to put a new logo on the top and use the stuff because they're really helpful. Connie, did you have something?
Well, yes. Yesterday, before I came over here, I noticed on Facebook that Steve Reid had announced that he and Kathy were having their 50th wedding anniversary today.
And did he announce that we're never together on our anniversary?
Yeah, well, so that means that we all signed a card.
Oh, that is so sweet of you.
So,
Thank
yeah.
you. Thank you.
So
thank
thanks for spending part of your anniversary with
yeah,
us.
I hate
and
to say it, but we
blessings.
don't even put it on the calendar until it happens. And that's probably why we're never together. We're never together. So we did. When I said I got COVID, we did a Rhine River cruise from Amsterdam to Basel for our 50th wedding anniversary. So that was kind of cool. Yeah, and some of you have known me since we got married, so you know that was a long time ago. Do you have something too? You're kind of waiting at the microphone. I don't have a microphone spotter over here.
That's all right. Several random things. Thank you for all the information this morning. One of which is one of the thoughts that came to mind in terms of evaluating whether or not to report. I'm going to volunteer somebody that I'm not sure that I've had permission to do, but I'm going to do it anyways. Many of you know Kathy Melhorn in our church. If you don't know Kathy Melhorn, well, she's very connected to the Mac world, but she's a physician who teaches at KU Med in Wichita, but she is one of the top couple of doctors dealing with child abuse in the state. She's
Very well known.
in large part responsible for the Child Advocacy Center in Wichita, which is a huge, massive resource that if you don't know about that, find out about it. It's wonderful. But if you really need to ask somebody their very good professional opinion about a situation, she would be a very good one. And if you need to get a hold of her, let me know. So not going to volunteer her for that for everybody, but within the
Well, and
district, I think that's worth it.
She is so well-known in the
Yes.
community that she would have suggestions of other people.
Yes, but even if you're looking for a brethren gal to call
Yeah.
at 10 o'clock at night. The other thoughts that came to mind that seem worth sharing, one of which is, we've been talking about this in the context of child abuse, although it seems important to me at least to make sure that there are differences between children and adults, but all of the same dynamics apply to abuse of all people at all levels. So all of this stuff applies to elder abuse, applies to differences in power, whether it's pastor and female person you're counseling, whatever. So like all of this applies to all of it. The one thing that I would challenge you on.
Okay, good.
When I first started in pastoring in the late 90s, early 2000s, when the Catholic sex abuse scandals were first exploding, I remember thinking to myself, man, I think Mennonites I was Mennonite then, but I think Mennonites and other Anabaptists, we haven't experienced this because of our theology of peace and reconciliation. Promptly after that, the John Howard Yoder abuse was exposed. And if you don't know John Howard Yoder, he is the single most influential Mennonite theologian of the 20th century. Also probably raped north of 100 women. And like people in systemic seminary level kinds of things were involved in keeping that suppressed for a whole lot of reasons. Since then, the Mennonite world, there has been a flood of people, as you have pointed out, have now come forward, and there are systems in place for that. I'm of the mind that the brethren we're not aware of the level, but we're not any different. So the long story short is just to say, statistically, Anabaptist denominations, we may have theology that's helpful, but we are statistically no different than anybody else. Do not assume that we are somehow better or more exempt from abuse.
Well, and actually, I would challenge that by saying we may be worse.
Yes.
Because the only denominational study on domestic violence, this is not on child abuse, but the only that I know of study across a denomination was done in Winnipeg. And Winnipeg, as you know, it was done among Mennonites, and Winnipeg is the largest metropolitan Mennonite community in the world.
Yep.
And it was done there, and their domestic violence rates were higher than the national average.
Yep.
And to me, that's embarrassing.
Yeah.
So, we're certainly not
Right.
better at an
Yes.
exam, but we may be even worse.
Yeah. The other thing that just worth throwing in there, or just reminding people, you're touching on this right now, but the issue of believing victim stories when they come forward and report is massive. Oh gosh, it's getting to be 10 years ago, or well, maybe 8 or 9. I wrote an article for Dove's Nest because of a situation that I wound up being fairly close to, sort of, about the emotional impulse not to report, particularly when it's against somebody who has been very influential for a lot of people in a lot of different places. And essentially, the point was, there's this impulse of, oh man, but they've done so much good. And if I report, then I am somehow undoing their good works. And I'm taking them down or whatever. The ultimate point of the article was to say, yes, that's a normal thought, but it's not the accurate one. The accurate one is, by reporting, you are not undoing their good works. The person who is undoing their good works is the person who has done the abuse. They have undone their own good works. You are merely caring for the victim. And that's a pretty significant shift in thinking, and just one that's worth being named. But at points I have been more skeptical about, well, maybe they're not telling the truth or whatever. In recent years, I have been disproven of that, and that If you were going to err on any side, the error is believe them, period.
Yeah.
Period. Yes, there are a couple of cases where people may be manipulative by trying to report a story, but those are they're very, very few.
Yeah,
So,
what I've heard is that we used to say children don't lie, but that's not true. But the cases where you might be skeptical are when you have bitter divorces. Sometimes there are accusations and coaching done in those situations. But, that's where it's your job to believe and report. It's the professional's job to investigate. So Randy, you got something for us too?
As I've been thinking about very good stuff here, I've been thinking about a larger issue of recognition of the ways we unintentionally abuse people by not recognizing the dignity in them. That dignity is the beginning point of understanding all human life. And so I'd highly recommend Donna Hicks' book on dignity. It is one of the most profound transformational books for my journey. I wish I'd have had it the first days of my ministry. But she does two books, one on just plain dignity, and that's a revised after 10 years, but also for dignity for leaders in the church.
Yeah.
And I don't think we could do better as far as one resource that's a good supplement.
That's a really good tip. Yeah. I appreciate it. You guys are so smart, and Chris came down too and talked about elder abuse during the break, and I failed to mention that, but it's all the same. It's all the same. It's about power and control, and sometimes, like I said in the beginning, it's who you have access to. I mean, you may beat your wife, and then then she dies, and you beat your mother-in-law. It's about power and control. And the dynamics are very similar. There's some subtle differences, but yes, more over here.
Just a very quick comment. There's another resource called Into Account, and it's based in Lawrence, Kansas. I think it's headed up by a PhD named Stephanie Crable, if I'm not mistaken. And they're actually right now working with Old Order Anabaptists to try to resolve some conflicts that they've had and some abuse cases. So highly
That's a great
recommend it. It's
resource.
called Into Account.
That's great. I want to make sure you all have my email before we're done here, but Randy, would you email me that resource you just talked about, and could you email me that? Because I'd like to know about that.
Really resonated with what you said about how we sometimes, from our theology, we get things really messed up as far as what we relate to the people of our congregation. One resource that I found helpful, and it's been quite some time ago, by Dennis and Sheila Lynn, a book entitled Don't Forgive Too Soon.
Ooh,
And,
I like the title. Yeah.
pardon me?
I like that title.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they actually they talk about forgiveness from a standpoint of grief and relate it to the Kubler-Ross's steps, and that, if we forgive too soon, then we have violated ourselves many times.
Yeah.
It's really a helpful resource.
Yeah.
It's old,
Yeah. No,
been
that's
around
great.
a while, and there may be other better resources on that. But forgiveness is something
We
that...
really want to put a bow on it, make it over, and make it pretty, and go back to the way things were.
And we
so
preach that.
then we do that. I was extremely fortunate at the time. I didn't know how fortunate I was, but when I was in seminary, I took a course from Elie Wiesel, and he's the noted author and Holocaust survivor and whatnot. And it was interesting, one of the comments he made, because we were talking about forgiveness, and he said people are always asking him if he forgave the people who killed his family and the people who are complicit with the Holocaust. And he said, in his entire life, not one individual person ever, or organization, ever came to him and asked him for forgiveness. And he said the culture expects him to forgive the perpetrators, but doesn't ever ask the perpetrators to ask for forgiveness. A step's missing. I thought that was really, yeah, great. You guys are just awesome. I love doing a group like this because you're smart. So anyway, okay, let's, I want to just say that I gave you a resource on confidentiality. There's a printed thing, I believe it's an article by Marie Fortune on why it's important, why it's important to report and all of that. So I figured that was something you could read. So, here are what I call essential elements of congregational response. You want to raise awareness, talk about, go back to your churches and tell them you did this training. Talk about it. Figure out ways that you can put all of these, elder abuse, domestic violence, rape, child abuse, into Sunday school curriculums, if you have one of those Sunday school classes where you pick a book and you read a book and you study a book, or if you belong to a book club, pick one of these resources. And I liked Randy's point that it doesn't have to be directly on the topic. It can be on the broader topic of treating people with dignity and mutuality. I always think that it's really important when you do premarital counseling to talk about domestic violence, and we don't do that very often, but we should, because the statistics tell us that it's going to happen in more relationships than we can imagine. So we need to address it. So how can we do that? And people are afraid to talk about it. I always say, talk to a physician, because it's now the law that every physician at your annual visit has to ask you whether your relationship is healthy or unhealthy. And they actually give you some good language for asking that. You can talk about, if somebody starts to tell you about their struggles in their marriage, you can confidentially and quietly say, do you feel like your marriage is a healthy marriage? What elements are unhealthy? And sometimes they'll talk about the good things, but then they might tell you also about the bad things that are happening. Support families with concrete resources. Think about ways that you can help families if this happens to them. Establish policies and procedures. One of the things I did is that I put in your resources some sample policies. There's more at Faith Trust website, so that you can look at what kinds of policies a church are recommended to have in terms of setting up protocols. And a lot of the protocols are very simple things, but they're a pain in the neck, and sometimes they're expensive for us. You should never have a room where adults meet with the children that doesn't have a window in the door or a window into the room. It protects the adult from unfounded accusations too. Okay. At Family View Center, when I got there, they had purchased the building a few years before, and they had renovated. And at the time, they had a male development director who I later found out had some very inappropriate relationships. But he spent money to have every door in that building replaced to be a solid door, because it had been a correctional facility and all the doors had windows and glass in them. And he didn't like that. He kept telling people, what I do in my office is my own business. I later learned about what he thought was his business, and it was not good. But I spent, 5 years, I just couldn't have male social workers who had to have their door propped open all the time. And, it was just an unbearable situation. But we just worked our way through the whole shelter and put all that glass back in. And so you got to figure out how to do it. You need to have policies that don't allow an adult to be alone, basic, with children, that you take somebody else with you. If you're taking children to the bathroom, 2 people go. It's really protection against unfounded stuff, but it also protects children, because then you can say, Mary was there. And you don't send 2 family members, a husband and a wife, or 2 sisters to do it. You have 2 people who are objective, so there's someone who can verify what's going on there. I think one of the killers for small churches is you need to be careful about the gap between the age of that college student that comes home and the Sunday school class. A lot of kids come home from college as freshmen and sophomores, and then you put them in charge of a junior high camp. And actually, there's not much of an age gap there, and that's really not recommended. You want a bigger age gap, and so that's not the place to have it. Put those kids working, take those older high school kids and college kids and have them work with younger children, but have a substantial age gap between there. And simple things like the first year I did the Texas Mennonite Children's Camp, I had a counselor that quit on me because I had a rule. And it was just a rule that I found on a list of recommended rules, and it was that adults and children shouldn't hang out in the parking lot in cars. And he quit completely because he said, it's my right to sit with a child in my car and talk to him. And I thought, no, it's not. We're not going to have any counselors doing that. You talk about setting it up so that you have privacy and you're in the car. No, we're not doing that. And I've always wondered why he threw this huge, enormous tizzy fit tantrum and made a big deal out of he wasn't going to be a counselor and we couldn't have camp without him. We did, and it was fine. So, having rules like that protect people and also protect children. And protecting children is the primary reason we do it. So you need to look at those, and those kinds of resources are readily available and online. And, if you, like I said, if you have a daycare center, or even if it's not related to you, go to the local daycare center and ask them about their rules, because a lot of churches, camps, Boy Scouts now are real careful about how they do things, because they had, it's like we see waves of, who was it that said when the Catholics were having, it's the Baptist turn, we're paying tag. Now it's the Baptist turn to have scandals. This is another one of those blobs I really like. Procedures for preventing sexual abuse, okay? So training needs to be an ongoing thing. It's highly recommended that you do training. May only be a couple hours, but do training with your Sunday school staff. If you have an after-school program, you need to have somebody come out and talk about child abuse for an hour or two. And it needs to be done on a regular basis, so there's review for the people who had it before, but you catch everybody who's new in it. You need to have guidelines and policies that are written out so you can hand it to people and say, this is what we do. These are the rules, You take someone else with you when you take a child to the bathroom. You don't do this kind of thing. You do that kind of thing. How you're going to increase the visibility and take care of things. So you see there it says things like bathroom and diapering and discipline and all kinds of things there. Then defining and clarifying who reports. We've talked a little bit about having a team of people you can talk to, know who the team would be, plan for congregational care. I would say in Brethren language, it's really important. Maybe have a discussion with deacons about how you would do care groups if you needed to do them. Just say, on the off chance that a lot of things that could happen. You can have a variety of things that happen. Could we think about having some, a deacon and 2 or 3 others that would provide a care group for an individual in a system? But this gives you some stuff to think about what you can do. So yeah, there's a sample policy for you. In the stuff, child safety checklist for churches. A covenant of limited access, that's what we call the contract for someone who has been convicted of sexual offenses who might want to continue in your congregation, so that you set up some rules about what they can and can't do, when they can come to church. Sometimes it's just varies. Those are all over the map, and they vary within a church, because basically what you got to do is you got to sit down and say, how can we keep children? Maybe that person has never taught Sunday school, doesn't interact with kids, and in your facility, so the rules can be pretty simple. But you may have a facility where you have to have more rules, because just wandering around the building, she could come into contact with children. So all of those things are in your handouts so that you have them and take them. I did overwhelm you with handouts. I think this is really critical. Please remember, a child victim is never, ever, ever, ever responsible for causing the abuse. And the child victim is never to be blamed for the abuse. And we do it inadvertently and intentionally sometimes. So, well, she's very pretty, so it's no wonder that happened. Or we make comments that really blame the child. A child victim is never capable of consent to the abusive behavior, either legally or, in our case, even more important, morally. They are not capable of giving consent. We were just talking about women who have been trafficked, and 20 years ago even. I'm embarrassed to say Family Abuse Center 20 years ago, 30 years ago now, because it was a good 15 years before I came there, but 30 years ago would not admit women who worked in the sex industry into the shelter. And you talk about some of the most brutalized women in the world. And when you start to reframe a lot of that as sex trafficking, you start to see a very different kind of picture about how they are victims. And you start to understand that situation very, very differently. And I think that's important that we, human trafficking is a really great topic to take on if you're in a congregation that sometimes it's hard to have difficult conversations. Because I believe that human trafficking is one of those topics that whether you're conservative or liberal, Democrat or Republican, you can talk about. Our sheriff in town is not a person politically who I'm buddy-buddy with, but I love what he's done around human trafficking. I mean, he's made it a national priority, and has our deputy sheriff is on Good Morning America and places like that, because he is deeply committed to human trafficking issues, and he has called together a county-wide roundtable on human trafficking, and it crosses every boundary you can imagine. You know, we have pastors from African American churches and Hispanic churches and white churches, and we have law enforcement and police officers from little towns out in the county. I mean, it crosses everybody, and I don't think there's any group that I work with that is as diverse as that, but united on that issue. Might not be able to talk about anything else, but we can talk about that. Because I think we really are getting better clarity about what human traffic is. And, you know, it's not bringing Asian people necessarily into this country, or Mexicans. That's what everybody thinks in Texas. It's in our community with our own people, and it's happening all around us. Child sexual abuse is always wrong and is solely the responsibility of the abuser, and so that's part of it. So I said, after the abuse, what then? You want to tell the truth. It's hard for some people to hear. I highly recommend congregational meetings. Gossip is not your friend. Rumors are not your friend. You might as well have everybody come to a meeting and tell them, this is what happened. We have an accusation. I worked as a consultant with the Church of the Brethren where the incident took place between two children, basically, in the congregation. And it was a very difficult situation because you're talking about two families in the church. And there are people who don't think of the young man as a perpetrator. And in some sense, he is a victim. In his case, he's disabled. And so he doesn't always understand everything. So he is, in a sense, a victim. But what he did to the little girl was unconscionable. And it takes that kind of blunt conversation, because I don't care how bad the situation is, the gossip is going to be worse. They're going to make it worse. So it's much better to have that invite parents, have them get together and say, this is what happened. Okay? You always need to get permission of the victim and their family. And please remember that you don't have to have permission of the perpetrator. But you have to talk to the family, because there are families that don't want anyone to know what happened. They don't want their daughter to go through a trial. They don't want their daughter. I mean, that's why some people are reluctant to report. They don't want to relive what happened. So you need to have permission. But particularly if it happened at church, you've got to be able to talk about it. So you have to judiciously and carefully talk to families and get their permission. And then I think you really want to take on that care and restoration and healing and care groups and really do things to help that get better. While every child's story is actually a report of abuse, the truth needs to be determined to prevent further harm to the child or false allegations. So, another reason for you to make sure that you report. There is an article you should have called Caring for the Congregation If Abuse Has Occurred. And for those of you who have either had someone who's been convicted that's in your congregation, I can't tell you how much damage rumors do. One of the first congregations I worked in, we had a choir member who, the rumor was that the school district had fired him for inappropriate relationship with a student. I think in actuality, they gave him a chance to resign. So there's no paper trail, nothing public. And he wanted to direct the children's choir. And that's where you get really complex, murky things, because if you talk to him, he never did anything, and he just left the school district. And he actually, 30 years later, came back as a substitute teacher. And, that just really bothers me. I don't have a lot of question in my mind, but that he did have an inappropriate relationship from the way the details were explained to me, but I could have been wrong. But because the school district at that time just wanted to cover it up and move on, you didn't have the tools you needed, which is not very good. So there is a second video. I showed you that first video, and I don't know if I have a picture of it. Yeah, it's going to come up here. That deals specifically, this one, Bless the Children, is specifically on doing child sexual abuse prevention in your church as a curriculum, how to go about doing it, how to put policies in place. So up here at the front, some of you browse at these. Two things are mine that I did with Faith Trust, and they're available at Faith Trust, but I did this preventing child abuse. I did this about the same time as I did Jubilee curriculum. This one's for kids 5 through 8. The other one's for 9 to 12. It's Sunday school. It's meant to be an hour. It's got 13 lessons in it, which fits into the typical church school quarter. So it means putting aside the regular curriculum for a quarter, and you can do it. But you can also use it as a vacation Bible study, or you could use it for an evening special thing. You do it, and you break the kids into groups, and you do it. But it's specifically curriculum for doing that. And this video really walks through it's well done. It's a fictitious church, but it walks through the way this church set that up. How they talked to the parents, how they got their permission ahead of time to have this class and to do it. The congregations that I've served, because it's me insisting, have done this curriculum on a rotating basis. We were small enough that we didn't have a first grade, second grade, third grade class kind of thing. So I did first through third grade class every 3 years, so that every child that went through there got the curriculum, and then 5th through 8th. This Healthy Boundaries is the Faith Trust curriculum for youth. And if you look at it to see what it's got in there, I took the DVDs out because one of the things I did is I packed all my stuff to come here before I flew to San Francisco, and because it's 104 and probably 110 in the parking lot at the airport, I took all the DVDs out because I figured they'd all warp during the week I was gone. So I don't have the DVDs in there, but there are 2 DVDs that go with that. So that's really good. Good curriculum for in congregations for doing something with kids. A lot of people are reluctant to take it on that directly, and that's fine, but then really look at those resiliency issues and make sure that you're building relationships so kids can really talk to you. But if you want to take it on, this is, I thought when I was testing this stuff, because I always test when I'm a pastor, I thought when I was testing it that I was writing the first part when I was in Berkeley, and their school district was taking this on like storm, and I thought, oh, these kids don't need it because they're getting it all at school. And what I found the most interesting is particularly the high school kids said, yeah, we learn a lot of this in school, but we never get to talk about values. We talk about that it's wrong, but we don't talk about why it's wrong. And we don't talk about an individual's dignity and worth. And so they really appreciated even reviewing. And with little kids, it's stuff like, what are private parts? Parts of your body that are under your bathing suit. So, and it gives you clues for talking about that. And so, I think it's all really helpful. This thing, reducing the risk of child abuse in the church, is United Methodist, but it's a real helpful kind of thing. And it has implementation strategies and procedures and tells you a lot about just what you want. I think there's an updated version of this even available. I have some things over here that are, I love this thing. Let the Children Come. Jeanette Harder, who's a friend of mine, wrote this one. It's a Mennonite tool, but it's really great for everybody. Preparing faith communities to end child abuse and neglect. A lot of practical stuff here, and it's really a wonderful book to have on your shelf. There's another resource that I did not bring that I should have brought, which, well, I know why I didn't bring it. I didn't bring it because I'm not supposed to be talking about domestic violence. But there's a really good Faith Trust little book. It used to be $2.50. Now it's probably $5, maybe $6. It's a fairly small book that talks about, it's answers to Christian women about domestic violence. So it talks about submission and stuff. And it's cheap enough that I have always, as a pastor, kept 4 or 5 on the bookcase so that even if I suspect something's going on or somebody kind of raises issues, it's a easy to read, almost a pamphlet, a little bit bigger than that, maybe 50 pages, that you can hand to somebody. And I think it's just a great resource to have around. You can put it in your library in a place where people can see it, and it just answers some of the questions like, am I to blame for this? And the Bible tells me I'm supposed to submit, so do I need to keep doing this? But it's just helpful kind of thing. So that's there. And then these 2 things are from insurance companies and whatnot. Nonprofit risk management, child abuse in your organization, reducing the risk of child abuse. A little bit more from a legal perspective and whatnot, but that's important for you to know because, the United Methodist Church in the 80s went through huge scandals because they were summarily transferring pastors that molested just off to other churches and not telling the new church. And they had these huge multi-million-dollar lawsuits. Back then they were $1 million, and we thought that was outrageous. Now they'd be even more. But you can understand how parents felt when their child was molested by a person who had molested children in his previous congregation, and the United Methodist Church just reappointed him, kind of thing. But the Methodists got really smart about child abuse and take it very seriously and take training very seriously. And so that, that's another resource too. If you have a United Methodist Church in your community, you could ask even if you know the pastor there, about some resources, or look even online at the United Methodist Church, because they were really at the front of that. But I have to say, UCC churches and Presbyterian churches, it's interesting. Now I live in Baptist land, and I've never experienced anything quite like Baptist churches because they are so independent. They ordain people locally in their church, and there's no I just did an ordination, helped with an ordination for a young man who used to work for me, and the person next to me said, wouldn't it be really interesting if we had a national office of ministry and we would put claims of clergy misconduct in files at them, and before you hired a pastor or as you were hiring, you could see whether the person had any. And I'm thinking like, yeah, what a creative new idea. That's what denominations do, but that's not the way the Baptist denomination works. So, look for other stuff, but this stuff is stuff here for you to look at, and just so you know why it's there. Bless the Children is the name of that video, and it just really walks through all the steps and shows this congregation that decided. So you see the pastor talking about child safety from the pulpit, and you see the meetings that they had at the level of Sunday school teachers, and then the training they did with Sunday school teachers, and then you actually see them implementing the curriculum. And it's a fictitious church, but they actually got a group of kids together and actually did the curriculum. So it's real from that standpoint. So that's a good thing. One of the things I love about it too is, it's scripted, but they took every complaint that a person could ever have about why you shouldn't do child sexual abuse prevention training. Like the community might think that we actually have people here who abuse, and they take all of those common questions and work out how to respond to it. So I guess what I'd like to do is, there's some slides coming up that I think are kind of important, but we're going to run here into the last half hour pretty soon. And before we do, I'd like to just sort of ask, somewhere here is this one. Do you have personal resistance to talking more about child abuse in your congregation? Do you think your congregation would be ready to report and know what to do? I see chuckles. That's not a good sign. What concerns do you have about taking some of the stuff that you've learned here back to your congregation? I'm going to have to ask you to do that, sorry. Just because some of us, and I say us, including me,
I'm afraid it's going to be downplayed. They know it's going on, but they don't want to report. Or, oh, yeah, we know so-and-so does such and such, but we're watching. And so that concerns me.
it's a concern. Is this going to be like camp when you're a teenager and you go and when you come back, you don't even have the words to tell your family how important that experience was and what you learned? Have I fired you up enough to say, we need to do something, or at least I need to move out of my comfort zone a little bit and think about it? I think we're asking you to, oh, here comes some, Alan's coming up again. I think it's really important that we don't just learn about this and raise awareness, but that we actually try to do something. And I think that's the hardest part.
In terms of getting fired up about stuff, one of the areas that I would like to encourage this district and ultimately our denomination, but this is one of the areas where I think we need some more ongoing and intentional education, but also improvement in our structures. And I mean, I say this as someone who is involved in some of those structures, but our district is not at the place where it needs to be in terms of accountability and education and understanding on a widespread level. We have good people who are well-intentioned, but there is a lot more that can be done. The places, the churches that I've, and conferences and districts that I've been involved with that have done that kind of stuff before, unfortunately, there are reasons why, and that there were situations that forced them into doing that as a large group. I don't wish that on us, but I do wish us to get a bit more organized on that.
It's so much harder
Yeah.
if you have a situation and then you have to react to that and put things in place after the fact than if you think about it ahead of time. And even if you don't have an exact roadblock map and you know step by step what you're going to do, if you think out things ahead, and I mean that about, your comment was really good. These issues are about so many issues. If you think about it ahead, and the best preparation I had to be a pastor was when I did CPE in a hospital, quite frankly, because I learned how to help people get into the mental health system. And I had so many colleagues that didn't know what to do when somebody had a real life psychiatric breakdown, and I thought, score one for my seminary education. I knew what to do. That's a totally different topic, but when you think ahead and you know ahead what you think you're going to do, if you have policies before you have something that's going to wind up in the newspaper, you're way ahead. And I think your point about at the district level is really important.
The other thing that I would just throw in there in terms of your question was something to the effect of how do you emotionally respond to this kind of stuff. One of the hard things that I have experienced personally by taking some more vocal stances at a couple of points, I have relationships that I'm not sure I will ever speak to people again. And our inclination, especially as a church that likes to say, well, we love our enemies and we want to care for everybody. One of the hard realities to come to, and you've mentioned this, is saying that everybody deserves to be a part of the church does not mean that they deserve to be a part of this particular congregation.
Or that they should be.
Or
it's
that they
good for
should
them.
be.
Yeah.
And that there will, yes, it is a reality of reporting or dealing with some of these that you will likely lose relationships with certain people and that you will probably never get them back. And that hurts. However, you also have to remember that by doing nothing, you are default choosing to break the relationship with the victim, whether you realize it or not. Doing nothing is still a choice, and it's hard either way, whether you're aware of it or not. And so it's a question of, are you, especially for people who are in positions of leadership and positions to make those kinds of choices, it's not a question of do I report or not, or do I lose a relationship or not. It's a question of whose relationship am I willing to damage? And is it the person who has been doing the damaging already or the person who's already been damaged? And it's an extremely hard thing to do. So think through that
Yeah.
now
Yeah.
ahead of time and prepare yourself for that grief wherever it may come.
Yeah. Yeah. Sarah.
First, I want to say thank you. 2 years ago, when this body called me as moderator-elect, I reached out based on the training that Lois and I both received from you in Northern Plains. Unfortunately, we had the opposite. We didn't have the training prior to incidences that occurred. And that was one of the things that going to annual conference and hearing Josh Brockway speak on child abuse really fired me up, saying we've got to do better. And I'm a kindergarten teacher in a previous, I don't know, future position. So I am a mandatory reporter. And in Iowa, the religious leaders were mandatory reporters. Kansas is behind. But the more preparation and preventative measures we can do, we want to provide a safe place for church, not a hiding place. And that's the big point.
I remember when somebody raised a concern because we weren't doing background checks on annual conference. Children's leaders. We went for a long time. Some of us had been talking about churches doing background checks on Sunday school teachers, and we turned around in annual conference, and the first thing I was told was, we can't do that, we don't have enough volunteers, and if we do that, then people will be reluctant to volunteer.
So if you're interested in volunteering, just come back. And I have rarely been more horrified.
And Chris and I have had lots of conversations. I understand that there are logistic issues and things, but one of the wonderful things in this new day and age, we live in a world where you can train people online before an event. And I'm not sure when some of us were raising this, that was as big a possibility as it is now. And they have implemented a lot of stuff at annual conference, but, we have to think at all levels about how this impacts, what we do. You could have a situation where you identify child abuse because your child plays with another child or goes to another person's, home. You could do it. It could happen at a family reunion. It could happen in your personal little orb, but it can happen at your church, and it can happen at the district, and it can happen to us nationally, and we have to think of all those different ways.
I have a question. Just I know what congregations are represented here, and I'm wondering, are there congregations out there that have policies in place? Like, does McPherson have a policy? Yeah, it looks like First Central. So these are congregations that could be our
They'd be a
supports.
great resource, because I don't know
Yeah.
anybody who keeps their policy as a secret.
Right.
You know, just ask them for a copy of their policy. Wow.
Yeah, and just to reach out to each other. So what I would suggest too is, as people are emailing you, or maybe copy me or
Yeah.
the district office
Yeah.
with suggested resources, if your congregation has a policy, if you just kind of say, hey, Kathy, we have one, we'd be glad to talk to other churches that are developing those. Or if you've used the curriculum, because I've heard that come up too. So my big, testimony on this is I was on a ethics thing around sex stuff, but it wasn't that the pastor was the perpetrator. It was that the pastor didn't protect the congregation adequately from the perpetrator.
Yeah.
And which was hard for everybody. And anyway, so I'll sit down for my, so just send those to us.
Yeah, I
and
think,
we'll send those out.
that's a great idea. I mean, if all of you who have policies would send them to Leslie, that would be a great start, because then, she'd have them to share, and it needs to be in the district office or something, someplace where you have, because you don't have to invent the wheel. We're so far behind. There are lots of people. I mean, if I was in a church that didn't have a policy, I'd be picking up 3 or 4 or 5 of them and reading them and sitting there and circling and highlighting and pick and choose, and, you don't have to invent it.
Yeah, and to hear the story of how that came about. Like, how did you prepare, how do you let people know? How do you, get the word out?
Yeah.
Because it's great to have a policy, but if nobody knows about it, then it's dead.
And how are you going to get people to accept it? Right. Which happens before you even write it, probably. We're going to develop this.
Quickly, that there's a difference between a child prevention policy, however, and a church liability prevention policy. And I think we need to be in favor of the child prevention policies.
We're not talking about, as much as we love you insurance people,
Yeah,
we're not talking about a liability thing.
Right.
We're talking about protecting the child. And what I like is that often protecting the child intersects with liability issues, but you do it from the perspective of we're gonna
Right.
protect the child.
Right.
And that's a really good point.
That's a priority. And I also want to just tag on to what Alan was saying, because it's not only choosing about which relationship we're going to keep and lose, but I think it's also choosing about whether or not we as congregations are going to be facilitators of abuse, which means we are then culpable for the abuse that happens to those children or those people. And that makes it a bit more stark, I think, for us. So.
Really good reminder.
I just want to piggyback on to what several have said, but if you already have a policy in place, that's great. But if you're looking to just get started and don't know where to start, or you want to enhance the policies that you have and add protections that you may not be doing, mutual aid is also a great resource. You can add us to that contact list, please.
Great.
Whether we insure you or not, we just want your congregation to be safe, and we want our children protected. So we have resources that can help you with background screening. If you don't know how to get started with that, we have some great resources to help with that. Checklists, more sample policies, things like that. So if you want some resources
great
on that,
resource.
we'll have it available at our booth tomorrow. So just come see me, come talk to me. And we've got some cards over there where you can contact us or add us to your contact list there. But we're here to help whether we have your insurance policy or not. So.
That's so great. Thank you. That's great.
So as I get all inspired and eager to, go back and say, aha, taking into account the prevalency of all the
this bad
abuse that
stuff.
happens, right? And how and the trauma that exists, whether it's from abuse or other kinds of experiences that people have had. How do you enter into this without re-traumatizing all the traumatized people?
Well,
who
I
are
would
there?
say slowly and carefully. I mean, I think you do have to. A mistake I have seen congregations do in the work that I've been doing is you can get jazzed up so much that you go back and you create even more resistance than there was before you got jazzed up and excited, and all of a sudden you've got more roadblocks than you had to deal with it. So I think you take it slowly. So if you're here and you're not the pastor, maybe have a conversation with your pastor about this issue and say, we just talked about it, and I'd like to do more on the church level. I'm not sure where that begins, but are there some other people that I should talk to? Can a group of us start to talk about these issues? One of the things that you have in your handouts, if I don't get to the slide, and I don't have to get to any more slides, is the nurture wheel. Okay, it's the positive, good side of the power and control wheel. And I think that's something that, if you have Sunday school teachers or anybody, if you can do some training around it, just even to take the 15 minutes, a half hour, to look at the ways, many, many ways, that we can nurture children, And if you don't feel like you can take on a policy or curriculum, which, you can get a lot of resistance to that, upgrading how you treat children, the way you treat children, using good curriculum, starting to talk to the pastor, starting to look at places where you can have people talk about, I will, Faith Trust actually is their new name, but they've had it now for 20 years. Before that, they were the Center for the Prevention of Domestic and Sexual Violence, and more. It was long. And so we used to call it the Center for the Prevention of All Things Bad. And that was shorter. There are a lot of issues in this, and you're absolutely right. There's dynamics that overlay with so many issues, but if you can start at the beginning with gentle conversations with people that raise the concern about it. I think if you already have a policy, this is a great time to do a little review of it and make sure it really does what you want it to do. And you may want to, if you have a policy, not only send yours to Leslie, but get the others so that you can compare and contrast a little bit and see maybe somebody has some other ideas. People do, when we were talking about spanking yesterday, and I was saying, it's hard for me to get up in front and say it's just absolutely wrong. I personally believe that, but it's hard for me to say that. Parenting, people are the most defensive about parenting over just about anything else, even given our political situation. The teacher in me just couldn't help it when kids ran down the aisle at the grocery store and I'd go, stop, walk. And I had to train myself not to do that, because if I turn and say to a child, stop, walk in a grocery store who I don't know, there may be an irate parent coming for me next, because we are very overly sensitive about parenting. And part of it is parents are overloaded. I think support we can give parents is another place that we can do some resiliency building, providing support for parents. But you have to really go slow, because there are people who will think, that you're talking about them and they're bad parents, or they're not doing it right, or a million different things.
We haven't gotten too far from the Old Testament, have we?
No.
We own our children.
And we own our women too sometimes. You can't be in people's face. To me, that's my soapbox that I stand on right now in this country. Is we're unable right now, and it's just a shame to talk about difficult things. We're unable to talk to people about things that can seem offensive, and so you have to take it really slow. So you don't want to just go back and say, I went to this training and we're going to implement, and everybody's going to have background checks and whatnot. You take it slowly. You say, well, we need to educate, raise awareness. So a lot of the stuff you've seen in the presentation says, first and foremost, raise awareness. Help people understand how pervasive child abuse is. So that means including it in sermons, do some book studies, suggest that as a topic for different kinds of things. Just find sort of subtle ways to wedge these things into even existing things. Leslie and I were talking about having more trainings on specific issues about this, so that we can get, not maybe district conference, maybe we get a different, broader group of people to come even so that we can talk about some specific things and go into much more depth about that. But, find ways to raise awareness. I think building resiliency in children and supporting families and creating an environment that helps families have healthy situations is key. And nobody's opposed to that. Nobody's opposed to that. I love the idea of an after-school program for kids. I mean, it's almost like a no-brainer if you can do it in this day and age where parents can't get time off work and kids are sent home and school has half days sometimes because that's the new norm. Or, by us, we have some school systems that are cutting back from 5 days a week to 4 days a week. And so leaves parents with nothing for their kids to do on Fridays. Find ways to do positive stuff. And, it's as you build that awareness and then support and you start talking about these issues, then it's almost natural to put in policies because you say, well, we got to do something. I think there are some things administratively you can do right away, depending on whether you have people who hear you. But stuff like talking about what do we do if we have to report? I think that's a welcome conversation among some leadership. We don't have a situation, but what would we do if? And you can talk about that, and that shouldn't freak anybody out. You should just be able, and getting to know your community resources shouldn't freak anybody out either. So, look at the long list and say, nobody's going to react negatively to the list. Let's start here.
Speaking of administrative, what did I do wrong? Speaking of administratively, we just saw at annual conference where 3 districts working together can put forth a bunch of volunteers who do great work. I don't know why we don't think in terms of this with these trainings. Let's get Northern Plains, let's get Western Plains, and let's get Missouri ARC. Meet in Kansas City and do this training together so we don't have to keep reinventing.
That's a really good idea. Yeah, because instead of however many people we have here, we could have 100, and it wouldn't make any difference, would it? Yeah, it's a great idea. Let me throw out just a couple other things. If you're really concerned about child abuse, supporting the foster care system is just really important. We don't have enough good, healthy homes for kids to be placed in. Think about how we care for children, because all of that is prevention work, and how we can support systems that are out there. Parents are looking for resources, so parenting classes, play groups, kind of thing where you have a chance to talk to moms and be with them. Respite care for parents. I've known some churches that have done some really good respite care. And we used to do it at one of the congregations I was at, where during Christmas time we do Christmas for the parents, and we just had the kids all day and planned one activity after another, and we just had community people sign up to come in, and they had a chance to go back and go to sleep if they needed to, or go out and go shopping. But, to have any of those kinds of even traditional things that are tried and true are really good ways to build families and build resiliency.
Yeah, it just occurred. I have a friend who is working as a paraprofessional in the Gardner school system. And he is finding a number of kids who aren't abused, but there's a lot of ignoring kids. There's a lot of letting them stay up too late playing games. There's a lot
With
of
kids that have a whole
swearing in
electronic
front
life.
of them. And then this kid will sit at his desk and say, Jesus Christ, Jesus Christ. I'm being really, really blunt here. But, is that abuse too? I think it
Well, it can be.
borders
And,
on.
I said to begin with that neglect is the largest category of abuse. And we have a lot of kids who parents think interaction is to hand them an iPad, So, yeah, and providing education about that and providing ways to support kids, building. I just think there's a whole positive end to this, and we need to really ramp that up, because while it is the same as elder abuse and whatnot, when you start abusing children, you are creating an impact that they will have the rest of their life. And we have an opportunity for changing that by being communities of hope and healing. And we have the same opportunity to be communities of hope and healing for elderly people and adults and whatnot, but we can do that especially for children. And I think children really need to be our priority. And I have said for a long time, how many church growth strategies include resiliency and nurturing children? It should, because parents are looking for that. That's one of the things they want. That's what they look for in a congregation. And so, you know, thinking about, and it's hard. I know it's hard when you're in a small church and you have one kid under 5 or something, then you think, how do we do a program? But trying to be creative about getting some things going that really will nurture people in the community and in your congregation. If you have a pen, I want to give you my email. I'm yours. Okay? It's Kathy Reid, Kathy, Reid, R-E-I-D. 47, I guess there were 46 people who wanted this email before me at gmail.com. So it's kathyreid47@gmail.com. Don't hesitate to email me about questions you have. We can do conversations either, because I do talk on the phone too. But if you have questions, I'm more than happy to talk to you about things. And I may not have the answer, but I might be able to point you in the right direction. And I hope that you have, during yesterday and today, realized how many resources you have right here in this room. This room is rich with people who know people who know people. And so you can reach out to each other too, to ask for help. Any questions? Otherwise, I can't believe it, I'm 10 minutes early. I'm shocked.
We still have several handout packets too. I was being very judicious about that, so they're here till they're gone. And we also have evaluation forms in a basket to put those in.
And I think we still have some of what I call excess handouts, and I am taking nothing home with me. So if you don't take it, Leslie's going to throw it away.
I'm not going to throw it away. You'll see it in other tables throughout. I'll probably stick it at the MAA booth.
Take stuff for somebody you know who might be interested,
Right.
who's not here, or a church that is not represented, or something.
And that includes a couple copies of sample policies and stuff on trauma and all that stuff. So I'm going to stick this back there. And yeah, Kathy and I had talked about this particular February training at Great Bend coming up is already covered, Randy's doing. But this had been discussed as a future training at Great Bend. And I mentioned that because we always invite Missouri, Arkansas, Southern Plains, Northern Plains to those.
Good.
As well. So. But I'm not in that role anymore, so be sure and let the district office or whatever know. Thanks. Well, I'll collect your policies if you want. It was mostly to create a network of here are congregations doing this work already, was what I was going to put together.
We got more here, people at the mic, using up my last 10 minutes. That's great. It should be.
No, I was just going to say, from the district perspective, we have a handbook, a child sexual abuse handbook that was written it's probably dated, probably needs to be updated. I know John Hoffman was a part of being on that team and getting that done, so we do have that policy and handbook in our district. If anybody doesn't have a copy, let me know. I still have some I could give to churches. Also, we do background checks for all the churches, congregations, anybody who needs one. Just contact the district office and we do those background checks for you. So
That's great.
Thank you. It's just a child abuse handbook. But I have one in the office if you need one. So, and I've had to run several times to do some errands for this weekend, and I just thank you I've been live streaming it on my phone, so I haven't lost track of what's been happening. So thank you.
Amazing
I
what
think
we
it's
can do?
fantastic.
Technology.
Before you leave, we would like to pray over you and those who have helped support this wonderful training, because we know you have to get out of here pretty quick, but I want to allow time for other comments and you to finish.
Randy, you have something before that?
Real quickly, Leslie's comment is already in our thinking, and congregational resourcing will make this one of their priorities this next year. So keeping in mind the 3 districts that were talked about, Nancy and I just talked about that, so just want you to know it's not idly sitting out there blowing the wind and maybe be lost. It's going to happen.
That sounds great. No, I can't thank you enough. I mean, when I say I genuinely, you call, and people thought I was crazy even when I was at ABC and in Elgin, because if Kansas called, I came. You know, it's home. It's home. And I love being here, and I am so deeply appreciative of your invitation, and thank you for letting me talk about, it's difficult stuff, but I think it's really important, and I'm glad to be able to do that.
Invite those who feel comfortable to come forward. We're going to lay our hands on Kathy. If you feel more comfortable from your spot, just put your hands up in prayers of offering of blessings.
Sure. Where do you want me to sit? Oh, absolutely. As long as you guarantee that you'll help me get up. I'm at that age.
We all have that problem.
And that is okay. God's arms reach everywhere. I will start, and then I will leave time if anyone wants to add words, and then I will finish when the time is ready. Gracious God, we are so thankful for your spirit that you have placed in Kathy. This topic is difficult. It's no fun. And yet, God, it is healing to so many. It opens doors to have these conversations, to reach out to those in need, and above all, to feel your presence. God, we thank you for Kathy and her willingness to serve you in this way. We pray that you give her safe travels as she leaves us part of her home, an extension of her wonderful work and her gifts. She has impacted many of us. Lord, I ask that you hear the prayers from others.
Lord, our children are very, very, very good. And we have a chance in this time in history to help things be different through the church, to respect and value them as human beings, to look forward to ways we can help, support, and encourage them and their families. And we thank you for Kathy, who has opened our minds, our eyes, our hearts to that reality. Bless you.
Lord, I thank you for your servant, Kathy, and for her reminder to us that as the church, we're always here for the victim. And also for your servant, Sarah's reminder to us that as the church, we are a safe place, not a place to hide.
Lord, so many of us each Sunday pray the Lord's Prayer. And the line in it that says, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And you have just opened a new way father is abused. No one is abused. In fact, it is a world of love. Keep that vision before us, Lord. And thank you for Kathy's gifts to that vision.